Chapter 14 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Primate. There was probably never a more striking contrast in personality than when Dr. Davidson succeeded Dr. Temple at Canterbury. "They remind me of silk and sackcloth," said a witty prelate of them after a certain interview. "Davidson really rubbed me the wrong way, yet I hardly knew it, for he had a velvet hat-pad. But Temple took a scrubbing-brush and fairly scoured away my notions." Around this collision of temperaments so diverse there has gathered a wealth of legend. It is related that when Dr. Temple was presented to Queen Victoria on his appointment to the See of London, it fell to the lot of Dr. Davidson, then Bishop of Winchester, to introduce him. "Your Majesty," said the courtly Bishop of Winchester, "will remember that Dr. Temple has had the honour of being presented to your Majesty before." "No," said the Queen, "I don't remember having met Dr. Temple before." "Surely your Majesty," insisted Dr. Davidson, gently, "remembers his lordship being presented on his appointment as Bishop of Exeter." "No," repeated the Queen, "I don't remember." "But," began the Bishop again, "your Majesty will recall—" Dr. Temple could stand no more. "What is the use," he broke in his harsh West Country accent, "of wanting Her Majesty to say she remembers when she says she forgets?" And not less delightful is that other story which tells how the two prelates were seated at dinner on either side of Her Majesty. "And you were appointed to Exeter in 1867?" said the Queen to Temple. "How wonderful that your Majesty's mind should retain such details!" interposed Dr. Davidson. "Not wonderful at all," growled Temple. "I've just told her." These legends, whatever their basis in fact, illustrate the attitude of the two men to life. Temple was no courtier. He carried directness of speech to the point of brutality. When an obsequious clergyman related to him the sad loss of his aunt, adding, "Your lordship will agree that I know what bereavement is," he replied tartly, "I can't say, I don't know your aunt." And I am told by one who was present that at some church ceremony in the west of London he had grown weary of the excessive amiability of the vicar, and at the subsequent dinner, when the vicar sat opposite, he turned the talk to the subject of smiling people. "I hate people who are always smiling," he said to his neighbour in his most biting tones. "They smile in the morning, and they smile in the afternoon, and they smile at night. They're always smiling. Look at the vicar there. He's always smiling." The vicar became suddenly grave. Dr. Davidson probably never said a wounding word in his life. It might even be said, without offence, that he, too, is always smiling. He is clothed in the armour of imperturbable blandness. He is never betrayed into wrathful speech, for the smooth current of his thought is unruffled by fierce emotion. He has ever ready the soft answer that turns away wrath. He is an impalpable foe. You cannot come to hard grips with him, for he smothers your attack with silken words, and leaves you angry and helpless, while he retires from the lists, cool and urbane as from a garden party. Indeed, he is one of those to whom the world is a garden party, where it is one's duty to be suavely polite, and where the unpardonable sin is over-emphasis. He moves in and out among the throng with smooth words for all, and frowns for none. The sun shines aloft, a gentle breeze stirs the foliage, and on the lawn there is the motion of colour and the hum of well-mannered speech. It is a world of delicate deportment. The polite man lives in perpetual victory. When Renan, pushed aside in the struggle to enter an omnibus, plaintively remarked that there is no room in the modern democratic world for the polite man, he was wrong. The assertive man may have the material victory, but the spiritual victory is always with the man of unruffled good breeding. He is never defeated, for though he may lose the prize, he does not lose himself. "I never give the wall to a scoundrel," said a man meeting Chesterfield one day in the street. "I always do," said Chesterfield, stepping with a bow into the road. The one kept his boots clean, the other went away in a cloud of victory. Dr. Davidson is the type of the polite man. He is the courtier statesman of the Church. He is governed by policy and not by emotion or mood. His personality never peeps out through that panoply of considered conduct. His immediate predecessors, Temple and Benson, were both men like as we are, the one brusque and practical, breaking in on the proprieties with crashing vehemence, the other swayed by emotions, introspective, and a little sentimental. Dr. Davidson is an embodied office. You never catch him without the lawn sleeves. You never surprise him out of the clerical and courtly accent. His career is characteristic of those qualities which have made the Scotch the most successful people in the modern world. They are the masters of themselves. They are never victimized by circumstance. They do not flame out into sudden passion. They keep cool, and it is the cool who inherit the earth. It is often said that Dr. Davidson has been lucky, and certainly no man ever achieved more with fewer of the externals of brilliancy. His path has lain among palaces. His companionship has been the companionship of princes. Chaplain in succession to 2 archbishops, married to the daughter of one of them, the favourite preacher and domestic chaplain of Queen Victoria, he was raised to the episcopal bench at 40 as Bishop of Rochester, refused the primacy before he was 50, and accepted it at 53, the youngest primate on record. For those who believe in luck, here indeed is a career that justifies their theory, a career all springing from that friendship with young Crowford Tate, who, like him, was one of Vaughan's lambs at Oxford, and whom, when he died, he succeeded as chaplain to the Archbishop. But after all, what is luck but the art of taking occasion by the hand, which in turn is the result of character? We would all have the Scotsman's trick of success if we could. We miss success not because we have souls above it, but because we lack the self-possession and command of circumstance. He is essentially a diplomatist who has strayed, as it were, into the Church. I never see him without being reminded of Velasquez's portrait of Innocent X. His kindly face has not the sinister note of that prelate, but it has the same calculating quality, the same sense of a mind delicately balancing the scales. He is the smoother of politics. He blurs the sharp lines of controversy. He sees both sides of a question so clearly that he takes neither. Black is not so very black, and white is really only whitish. He differs from you in sorrow, never in anger, and he leaves the door ajar for reconciliation. He wears no labels. He eludes the ritualist as he eludes the extreme evangelical, and embraces both in a universal benediction. He has no antipathies, and would be equally happy with Dr. Clifford or Lord Halifax, happier still with both, who would leave his presence arm in arm, convinced that they had really been of one mind all the time. No party can claim him. He might adapt the candidate's creed to himself. As for my politics, I glory in having nothing of the sort. I ain't a Whig, I ain't a Tory. I'm just an archbishop, in short. But he loves to be on the side of authority and of government, and prefers yea, yea to nay, nay. He is not unrelated to the Vicar of Bray. This temperament of compromise and conciliation makes for peace and pleasantness, but it fails in the hour of crisis. It does not rise to the great argument. A significant phrase is often more revealing than the most subtle portrait. Titian's Charles V is among the great achievements of art, but it tells so little of the Emperor compared with what he told of himself the day when he stood beside the tomb of Luther at Wittenberg, and those about him suggested that the body of the enemy that had triumphed should be disinterred and burned at the stake in the market-place. "I war not with the dead," said Charles, and by that chivalrous word we know him. So with Luther himself. He lives, one of the most vital figures in history, by virtue of those shattering phrases that leapt from his lips like thunderclaps that reverberate forever. "The Pope's little finger is stronger than all Germany," said the Cardinal Legate to him. "Do you expect your princes to take up arms to defend you, a wretched worm like you? I tell you, no, and where will you be then? Where will you be then?" "Then, as now, in the hands of Almighty God," cried Luther. Dr. Davidson will be remembered by a phrase of ingenious compromise. He will be remembered as the man who, sitting in the highest seat of spiritual and moral authority in the land, said that Chinese labour was a regrettable necessity. The moment came for a great word, and he uttered a discreet evasion. The moment came to say, "This is wrong," and he said, "This is moderately right." His speech wears the court costume as naturally as Temple's wore the russet coat of the Devon Moors. He thinks in crowns and sceptres. When speaking on the fundamental unity of Christians, it was characteristic that he chose as the two occasions which revealed that unity the death of the Queen and the consecration of the King. And even the stories of his wit carry us to the same atmosphere. At a meeting of the Kent Chess Association he remarked that though he was not a brilliant player, he could claim to represent all the pieces except the pawn. He had had a great deal to do with kings and queens, had lived in 2 castles, and was both a knight and a bishop. Except the pawn. It is a notable exception, for the pawn stands for plain humanity, the rest for the trappings of circumstance. His royal progress has not been witnessed without criticism by his fellow churchmen. His amazingly early elevation to Rochester was keenly discussed, and Archdeacon Lefroy is credited with the remark that "if any man was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, it was Randall Davidson." But I like his pluck, although he thinks archdeacons, small fry, scarcely worth noticing. And when he went from Rochester to Winchester on the ground of health, it was a London daily journal, friendly to the Church, and friendly indeed to him personally, which said it preferred the candour of Sydney Smith when he said, "I must honestly say that I have been happier all my life for every additional penny I have received." The thrust was tempting, but a little unjust, for the Primate's health has always been liable to collapse, since as a lad a charge from a gun entered the base of the spine. Every autumn he is threatened with peritonitis, and for months at a time lives on nothing but milk food. And it is fair to remember that he refused the primacy once, and accepted it with hesitation on the second occasion of its offer. He has not touched the imagination of the country as Temple touched it, by the sense of natural force and shattering veracity, or as Benson touched it, by a certain spiritual sadness, but he has filled his great office with a high sense of its responsibility. If he has seemed timid when the occasion called for courage, it is because he conceives that office as a moderating instrument in the national life, a check upon violent oscillations, an aid to ordered development. If one misses in him the note of the passionate assertion of right, it is not because his sympathy with right is lacking, but because it is restrained by the caution of the diplomatist, anxious to wield influence without associating his office with the cause of party. And it is undeniable that this caution is at times a source of power, as well as at others a source of bitter regret. It has, for example, given his intervention in the licensing controversy singular weight, the weight which attaches to the man who takes a side with profound reluctance. And though carrying caution himself to the uttermost extreme, he is not inappreciative of courage in others. It is a great thing, he told a friend of mine, speaking of the licensing bill, to have a government which dares to bring in a measure which it knows will lose its votes. He would be a greater personal force if he had the same indifference to consequences, but his office might have suffered, for until the Church is free, its head can never sound the clear trumpet note of spiritual challenge, but must utter himself in the muffled accents of compromise with the world. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. David Lloyd George. I was seated at dinner one night at 10 Downing Street beside a distinguished Liberal. "What a wonderful bust of Chamberlain that is in the hall," I said.
"Ah," he replied, "you mean the bust of Pitt. Yes, it is marvellously like Chamberlain. I wonder," he went on, musingly, as though the question fitted in with his train of thought, "I wonder what will happen to Chamberlain's successor." I looked up. "Chamberlain's successor? You mean—" "Lloyd George, of course." There was a faint hint of reproof in the "of course," as though I had asked solemnly for an explanation of the obvious. I looked down the table to where Mr. Lloyd George himself sat, his face lit with that smile, so quick and sunny, yet so obscure, his light voice penetrating the hum of conversation, with its note of mingled seriousness and banter, his whole air at once so alert and self-poised, full of a baffling fascination and disquiet. Yes, here was the unknown factor of the future, here the potentiality of politics. And here, too, was its romance. My mind turned to that little village between the mountains and the sea, where the fatherless boy learned the rudiments of knowledge in the village school, and where, in leading his school fellows in a revolt against the catechism, he gave the first hint of the metal that was in him. I saw the kindly old uncle, bootmaker, and local preacher worrying out the declensions and the irregular verbs of strange tongues in order to pave the path of the boy to the law. I saw that boy at 21, a qualified solicitor, with his foot on the ladder, fighting the battle of the village folk against the tyranny of the parson, who refused the dying wish of a dissenter to be buried in his child's grave. "Bury him where he wished to be," said young Lloyd George, strong in the law. "But if the gate is locked, break down the gate." And the old man was buried in his child's grave, and solemn judges in London pronounced a solemn verdict in support of the young Hampden. I saw him, still little more than a lad, leaping into the ring and challenging the squire of his village for the possession of the Carnarvon borough, challenging him and beating him. I saw him, with nothing but his native wit and his high-soaring courage to help him, flashing into the great world of politics, risking his fortune and even his life in support of an unpopular cause, escaping from Birmingham Town Hall in the clothes of a policeman, his name the symbol of fierce enthusiasms and fiercer hates. And then I saw him transformed from the brilliant freelance into the serious statesman, the head of a great department, handling large problems of government with easy mastery, moving great merchant princes like pawns on his chessboard, winning golden opinions from all sides, his name always on the lips of the world, but no longer in hate, rather in a wondering admiration, mingled with doubt. And now there he sat, the man who has arrived, the most piquant and most baffling figure in politics, the man, perchance, with the key of the future. What is the secret of it all? In the first place, audacity. Danton's great maxim is with him, as with Mr. Chamberlain, the guiding principle of conduct. He swoops down on opportunity like a hawk on its prey. He does not pause to think. He acts. He has no fear. The bigger the task, the better he likes it. The higher the stakes, the more heroic his play. He never fears to put his fate to the touch, and will cheerfully risk his all on a throw. When the great moment came, he seized it with both hands. He had two motives: his love of the small nationality and his instinct for the great game. The one gave him passion, the other calculation. Here was the occasion. He was the man. His business was being ruined. No matter. His life and his home were threatened. Good. The greater the perils, the greater the victory. And we roared hurrah, and so the little Revenge ran on right into the heart of the foe. Ran on and lashed itself to the great San Philippe of Birmingham, and came out of the battle smoke victorious, the one reputation made by the war, the one fortune born on the battlefield where so many were buried. And he has not only the eye for the big occasion and the courage that rises to it, he has the instinct for the big foe. He is the hunter of great game. "Don't waste your powder and shot on the small animals," said Disraeli, and he hung on to the flank of Peel. "Go for the lion," was Randolph Churchill's maxim, and he gave Gladstone no pause. Even to snap at the heels of the great is fame. It is to catch the limelight that streams upon the stage. There are names that live in history simply because Gladstone noticed them. Lord Cross and Lord Cranbrook came to great estate merely because they beat him at the poll. To have crossed swords with him was a career. Mr. Lloyd George's eye, ranging over the Government benches, saw one figure worth fighting, and he leapt at that figure with concentrated and governed passion. It became a duel between him and Mr. Chamberlain. It was a duel between the broadsword and the rapier, between the Saxon mind, direct and crashing as the thunderbolt, and the Celtic mind, nimble and elusive as the lightning. He has indeed the swiftest mind in politics. It is a mind that carries no impedimenta. Hazlitt once wrote an essay on "The Ignorance of the Learned," and declared that anyone who has passed through the regular gradations of a classical education, and is not made a fool by it, may consider himself as having had a very narrow escape. Certainly the man of learning, unless he wears it lightly, as Macaulay said of Milton, and has assimilated it easily, starts with a heavy handicap when he comes down to the realm of affairs. He is under the dominion of authority and the awe of the past. Mr. Lloyd George has no such restraints. He is like a runner ever stripped for the race. The pistol may go off when it likes. He is always away from the mark like an arrow. And it is not speed alone. When the hare is started, he can twist and turn in full career, for the hotter the chase, the cooler he becomes. He is the improviser of politics. He spins his web as he goes along. He thinks best on his feet. You can see the bolts being forged in the furnace of his mind. They come hurtling out molten and aflame. He electrifies his audience, but he suffers in print next morning, for the speech that thrills the ear by its impromptu brilliancy seldom bears the cold analysis of the eye. He is in this respect the antithesis of Mr. Churchill, though Mr. Churchill is like him in daring. I once had a pleasant after-dinner talk with them on the subject of their oratorical methods. "I do not trust myself to the moment on a big occasion," said Mr. Churchill. "I don't mind it in debate or in an ordinary platform speech, but a set speech I learn to the letter." Mark Twain said to me, "You ought to know a speech as you know your prayers," and that's how I know mine. I've written a speech out 6 times with my own hand. "Oh, I couldn't do that," said Mr. Lloyd George. "I must wait for the crisis. Here are my notes for the Queen's Hall speech," and he took out of his pocket a slip of paper with half a dozen phrases scrawled in his curiously slanting hand. The result is a certain thinness which contrasts with the breadth and literary form of Mr. Churchill's handling of a subject, or with the massive march of Mr. Asquith's utterance. But it has qualities of sudden eloquence, imaginative flight, and quick wit that make it unique in the records of political oratory. Above all, it has a quite unexampled air of intimacy. His swiftly responsive nature brings him into extraordinarily close relations with his audience, so that he almost leaves the impression of a brilliant conversation in which all have been engaged. This responsiveness, while it gives his speech its rare quality of freshness and exhilaration, is the source of his occasional indiscretions. Lord Salisbury's blazing indiscretions were due to his detachment from men and his remoteness from his audience. They were the indiscretions of an Olympian. The indiscretions of Mr. Lloyd George come from his nearness to his hearers. He cannot resist the stimulus of the occasion. It works in him like wine. It floods him with the riot of high spirits and swift fancy, until he seems to be almost the voice of the collective emotion. And yet, with all this sensitiveness to the external impulse, he is at the bottom the most subtle, the most resolute, and the most wilful force in politics. He has passion, but it is controlled. It does not burn with the deep spiritual fire of Gladstone. It flashes and sparkles. It is an instrument that is used, not an obsession of the soul. You feel that it can be put aside as adroitly as it is taken up. And so with his humour. It coruscates. It does not warm all the fibres of his utterance. It leaps out in light laughter. It is the humour of the quick mind rather than of the rich mind. "We will have Home Rule for Ireland and for England and for Scotland and for Wales," he said, addressing some Welsh farmers. "And for hell," interposed a deep, half-drunken voice. "Quite right. I like to hear a man stand up for his own country." The soil of his mind is astonishingly fertile, but light. He is always improvising. You feel that the theme is of secondary importance to the treatment. You have an uneasy fear that this wonderful fluency of execution may presently reveal another motif. You listen. Your quickened ear seems to catch a hint of coming change. He keeps your mind on the stretch. He fascinates you, plays with you, holds you with the mesmerism of the unsolved riddle. You would give anything to know the thought behind that gay, debonair raillery. He is indeed the least doctrinaire of men, as little doctrinaire as Mr. Chamberlain. No anchor of theory holds him, and he approaches life as if it were a new problem. It is a virgin country for him to fashion and shape. He is unconscious of the roads and fences of his forefathers. His maxims are his own, coined out of the metal quarried from his direct contact with life. He is not modern, he is momentary. There is no past, only the living present. No teachers, only the living facts. This absolute reliance on self gives a certain sense of lack of atmosphere. There is no literature to soften the sharp lines. There are no cool grottos of the mind, no green thought in a green shade. This detachment from tradition and theory is the source of his power, as it was the source of Mr. Chamberlain's power. He brings a fresh, untrammelled mind to the contemplation of every problem. It was said of Leighton that he looked at life through the eyes of a dead Greek. Mr. Lloyd George looks at life with the frank self-assertion of a child, free from all formulas and prescriptions, seeing the thing, as it were, in a flash of truth, facing it without reverence because it is old, and without fear because it is vast. The thing is rotten, he says, and in a moment his mind has reconstructed it on lines that acknowledge no theory except the theory of practical usefulness. Thus he has swept away the old effete port of London, and put in its place a system as original as it is ingenious. And all the world asks, why was this not done years ago? Like Falstaff, he is quick, apprehensive, forgetive, but he does not, like Falstaff, owe these qualities to Canary, but to the Celtic spirit that races like a fever in his blood. His apprehensiveness, indeed, is amazing. He picks up a subject as he runs, through the living voice, never through books. He does not learn, he absorbs, and by a sort of instantaneous chemistry his mind condenses the gases to the concrete. His intellectual activity is bewildering. It is as difficult to keep his name out of the paper as it was to keep King Charles' head out of Mr. Dick's memorial. He is always doing things, and always big things. His eye lights on an anachronism, like the patent laws, and straightway he sets it on fire. He does not pore over books to discover the facts about docks. He goes to Antwerp, to Hamburg, and sees. When he brought in his merchant shipping bill, he took a voyage to Spain and learnt about ships. And his passion for action grows with what it feeds on. He has yet his trumps to play. With all this energy and daring, the astonishing thing is that he has won the confidence of the most sensitive class, the commercial class, without losing the confidence of the working class. Like Mr. Chamberlain, he is essentially a middle-class statesman. He is no socialist, for, as I have said, he has no theories, and socialism is all theory. England, he said to me once, is based on commerce. No party can live by an appeal to labour alone. It must carry the commercial class as well as labour with it. What can I do for commerce was his first question at the Board of Trade. And he took up the merchant shipping bill. What can I do for labour was his second question, and he incorporated in it those valuable provisions for improving the life of the seaman. Wales looks on admiringly and a little sorrowfully at his giddy flight. He has passed out of its narrow sphere. The Parnell of Wales has become the Chamberlain of England. The vision of the young gladiator fighting the battle of the homeland has faded. Oh, for a falconer's voice to charm the tassel-gentle back again! Back to the resounding hills and the old battle cries that have grown far off and faint. Back to the pure idealism that stirred its pulse and its patriotism. It is proud of its brilliant son, proud of the first Welsh-speaking minister to enter a British cabinet, but it waits with a certain gathering gloom for its reward. Is it not 13 years since he led a revolt against the Liberal party on disestablishment, and is he not now a chief in the house of Pharaoh? Once it has been on the point of revolt, but he had only to appear, and it was soothed. Wales will get its reward quicker than if he had remained its Parnell, but it must wait the propitious season. He is forgettive, but he will not forget Wales, for Wales is not Birmingham. And so I turn to the figure at the end of the table with a smile so quick and sunny, yet so obscure. If the key of the future is anywhere, it is there. If the social fabric is to be reorganized, there is the man that can do it. He stands in the furrow that Mr. Chamberlain deserted. Mr. Chamberlain put his hand to the plough and turned back. He failed because he lost the vision of his youth and treated politics as a game and not as a gospel. Mr. Lloyd George will succeed in proportion to his fidelity to the inspiration, not of Westminster with its intrigues, but of Wales with its simple faith. I turned to my neighbour and I said, "Yes, I wonder." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16, Mrs. Pankhurst. It was at the memorable meeting at the Albert Hall, at which Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman made his first public utterance as Prime Minister, that the meaning of the Women's War dawned on me. There had been 1 or 2 preliminary skirmishes at Manchester and again at the Queen's Hall, but here was the first general engagement. The time was well chosen. The spirit of that meeting can never be recaptured in our day. It was the hour of triumph, a moment such as one cannot look for twice in a lifetime. The Balfour Parliament was dead at last. The long reign of Toryism was over, and Liberalism was born again after 20 years of obliteration, qualified by one feeble flicker of office without power. We stood on the threshold of a new time. All the nightmare of the war and Chinese serfdom, of adventure abroad and wrong at home, was behind. We looked, as it were, under an arch where through gleamed the untravelled world. It was like a vast thanksgiving, as after long years in the wilderness the exiles entered the land of promise. Suddenly I became conscious that something unusual was happening. There was a murmur below, as though a light breeze has ruffled the great sea of humanity that filled the area. All eyes were turned from the platform to a point in the boxes near me. I looked out, and my eyes encountered, hanging from the box next but one to mine, a banner with the legend, "Votes for Women." It was the signal of a new attack in the rear. Another Richmond was in the field. The Tory host was in ruins, but the Amazons were upon us. Now, whatever may be our private views as to the campaign of the militant women, we cannot deny that it revealed quite brilliant generalship. It may not have been magnificent, but it was war. It was extremely unladylike. The exaltation was sometimes unpleasantly like hysteria. The drama often bordered on the wildest farce. Occasionally there was the sense of an astonishing lack of humour, as when some of the suffragettes lashed themselves to the railings in Downing Street. The world would have said that that was typically feminine, but for the fact that as an achievement in futility it was easily surpassed by the police, who, instead of leaving them in the pit they had digged for themselves, solemnly rescued them and then put them in the lock-up. But with all its elements of comic opera, the campaign was the most brilliant piece of electioneering in our time. It discovered a masterly strategy, a sense of the moment to strike, a daring and a fertility of resource that commanded admiration, if not approval.
It was a revelation of the woman in action, shrill and tempestuous, with the velocity of the wind and a sort of sleepless fury that threw every convention to the winds. It was startlingly unlike the warfare of men. Men, in their ultimate political expression, are brutal. If you are a minister of whom they do not approve, they will smash your windows. But the women were more subtle. They got inside the hall. They hung on to the doorknob. They besieged you back and front. They made life intolerable with pin pricks. They murdered the orator's best periods and left his peroration in rags. They marched on the House in battalions. They stormed it in furniture vans. They penetrated the keyholes. You watched the river for suspicious craft, lest they should scale the terrace. Your eye roved the sky, lest they should descend by parachute from the clouds. It was a war divorced from all the rules of war. It was feline in its activity and cunning. It was unlovely, but it was business. It made the cause. Women's suffrage had been an academic issue for half a century. It became actual and vital, as it were, in a night. It was a pious opinion, discussed as you might discuss the Catiline conspiracy. It became an issue about which men were ready to fight in the last ditch. Who was the Moltke of this amazing campaign? Who was it who prepared her battalions and her strategy in such secrecy that no whisper of the menace was heard until the whole cannonade burst on the new government as it entered into office? I was presiding one afternoon at one of the sittings of the Conference on Sweating at the Guildhall when a small woman with a tired and rather sad face rose to speak. She spoke quietly, in a monotone, as if she were soliloquizing. It was as if an abstraction had found voice, so remote did it seem from any personal emotion. With great ingenuity her remarks drifted from sweating to the subjection of women who are the victims of sweating, and then, before the closure could be applied, the concealed battery was unmasked in Votes for Women. It was Mrs. Pankhurst making one of her raids. At the first glance it is difficult to associate this slight and pathetic figure with the authorship of so much tumult and with the inspiration of a movement so bizarre and frenzied. But soon the truth is apparent. She is not a woman. She is an idea. One idea. Now the dominion of an idea, provided it is sane, is the most potent thing in the world. Most people have either no ideas or are burdened with so many ideas that they are useless. They are like the normal committee described by Mr. Chamberlain. On every committee of 13 persons, he once said, there are 12 who go to the meetings having given no thought to the subject and ready to receive instructions. One goes with his mind made up to give those instructions. I make it my business to be that one. Mrs. Pankhurst does instinctively what Mr. Chamberlain did by policy. She leads by virtue of an obsession. She is the symbol of the potency of one idea, held to the exclusion of every other motive and interest in life. The idea is this, that women are the victims of an age-long tyranny imposed on them by men. That tyranny varies with time and latitude and social conditions. In its crudest form, among the savage tribes, it treats woman frankly as a slave, a beast of burden, a hewer of wood and drawer of water. In the East it imprisons her in the harem and regards her as the plaything of idle moments. In medieval England she was held something better than his dog, a little dearer than his horse. In Victorian England she was the graceful decoration of life, a symbol of sweetness and innocence, a creature with pretty kitten-like ways, but having no relevance to the business of the world. Today she is emerging into sex consciousness and beating at the bars of circumstance. The cage is enlarged, but it is still a cage. She goes to the university and is bracketed with the senior wrangler, but she is denied her degree. She qualifies for the bar, as Christabel Pankhurst did, but she is denied the right to practice. She enters the inferior walks of life and finds that there is one standard of payment for men and an immeasurably inferior one for women. She falls and finds that society has smiles for the betrayer and the flaming sword for his victim. At the bottom of the abyss, in the sunless court, she fights the last silent, helpless battle between starvation on the one hand and the lash of the sweater on the other. Everywhere she sees herself as the chattel of men. If she is happy, she may be serenaded and garlanded with jewels. If she is unhappy, she may be trodden in the mire. But one thing she cannot have. She cannot have equality of treatment. She cannot have simple justice, for she is a woman in a world made by men. "Madam," said Charles XI of Sweden to his wife when she appealed to him for mercy to some prisoner, "Madam, I married you to give me children, not to give me advice." That was said a long time ago, but behind all the changes of the centuries it still represents much of the thought of men in relation to women. It is not until one has entered sympathetically or otherwise into this conception of the serfdom of woman that one can understand Mrs. Pankhurst and her campaign of violence. She is a woman to whom the thought of this sex oppression is like a raging fever. It has burned up all other interests. It has driven her in turn from one political party to another, from Liberalism to the I.L.P., and from the I.L.P. out into a sort of political wilderness. She has deliberately chosen the role of Ishmael, her hand against the whole institution of society, whether the immediate cause be good or bad, for that institution represents to her only a single lurid fact, the dominance of one sex and the subjection of the other. She sees everything in life hinges upon that fact. At the Guildhall meeting to which I have alluded, she rose to put a question after Mr. Pembler Reeves had spoken. "Was the anti-sweating legislation in New Zealand," she asked, "passed before or after the women had the vote?" And a wan smile of triumph greeted the admission that it was after. The fact covers her whole sky. It hangs like a dark pall over her spirit, shutting out the sunshine. As Mr. J. Mallon says, in a sketch of her which appeared in The Woman Worker, "What she has to say springs from dark and somewhat bitter waters. Her metaphors are shapes of gloom. But at her best, as on one memorable day in Manchester, when we commemorated the Russians slain on Bloody Sunday, there is that in her voice and mien that stays in the mind forever. Then she passes from a recital of particular hardship to an impassioned contemplation of all suffering. The whole of the world's tears, and all the trouble of her labouring ships, and all the trouble of her myriad years." Her sombre face glows with impersonal pity and appeal. Her sad lips deliver the plaint of a sex. You no longer hear a woman's voice. You hear the voice of woman. It is the gloom of fanaticism, of a thought gnawing ceaselessly at the vitals and growing by what it feeds on. The spirit was inherent, for Mrs. Pankhurst comes of a revolutionary stock, and her grandfather narrowly escaped death at Peterloo. But it has been cultivated by circumstance. As a student at Paris, she was a roommate of the daughter of Henri Rochefort, and caught from her the spirit of Republican France. Back in Manchester she met and married Dr. Pankhurst, a barrister whose political enthusiasm equalled her own, and who made the original draft of the Married Women's Property Bill, giving married women the control of their own property, which subsequently became law. Together they worked feverishly for many causes, Mrs. Pankhurst herself serving on the Manchester School Board and the Board of Guardians. Then they leapt into national notice in connection with the battle for free speech in Bogart Hole Close. They won, but the victory cost Dr. Pankhurst much, and was not unconnected with his premature death. Left with a young family, Mrs. Pankhurst became a registrar of births and deaths, a position which, bringing her into direct touch with the tragedy of the poor, fed anew the flame within. Her purpose ripened. There were 4 children. They should be prepared, like Cornelia's jewels, for the cause and flung into the arena. She formed the Women's Social and Political Union, and out of the little group of half a dozen unknown women who used to meet in a room in Manchester has emerged the movement which has shaken the whole fabric of politics. She has in a high degree, apart from that intensity which is the soul of leadership, the gift of command. She has something of the aloofness of Parnell. She nurses, as it were, a fire in secret, has that independent life of the mind which seems unconscious of all external motive, and invites neither help, advice, nor sympathy. She seems to have no personal life and no emotions except that overmastering one of abstract justice, a stern, tyrannic thought that makes all other thoughts its slaves. She has the masterful will that evolves laws for herself and is indifferent to formulas. When challenged to act on the democratic constitution of her Union, she replied that democracy and constitutions are of times and seasons and are not sacrosanct in the realm of varying impermanent groups, a declaration of thinly veiled autocracy that led to a disruption. As a debater she has a mordant humour and a swiftness of retort that make her a perilous foe. "Quite right," shouts a voice from the gallery as she protests against the provision of the Children's Bill which makes mothers punishable in certain cases of mischance to children. "Quite right," she flashes back. "Before the law the father is parent, the mother is forgotten. Forgotten, forsooth, until there is punishment to be borne. Then they drag out the woman, and it is quite right." She is, above all, a leader in that her passion is always governed by the will. Her exultation is kept at white heat, but never, as in the case of some of her followers, gets out of control. Her extravagances are considered. They are not touched with the taint of hysteria. Her astuteness is evidenced as much in the limitation as in the violence of her campaign. Not a word of access to Parliament. You would gather that that was an ideal to which she was indifferent. It is, of course, the crown of her purpose, the end to which the present agitation is the preliminary. For she stands for the complete civic and political emancipation of woman, for full and equal citizenship, and out of that equality of citizenship she believes that there will emerge that equality of social condition and that equal justice which will remove the wrongs that afflict her sex. Whatever we may think of her methods, we cannot doubt that they have shaken the walls of Westminster and made a breach through which future generations of women are destined to enter into undisputed possession of citizenship, with consequences fateful and incalculable. It may be that the methods will be carried too far, that their success as an advertisement will lead to their adoption as a policy. In that case the cause will suffer, for the English people are not easy to coerce. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Lord Morley of Blackburn. Lord Morley is the only double first of his time. He is perhaps the only double first since Burke. Other men have won distinction in more than one field. Canning wrote verse, Disraeli wrote novels. Macaulay was an orator and a historian, as well as a statesman. Gladstone discussed Homer as vehemently as he discussed Home Rule. Lord Rosebery has trifled as piquantly with letters as he has with politics. Mr. Balfour has spun cobwebs in covers as well as across the floor of the House. But of none of these can it be said that he was in the front rank alike of literature and of statesmanship. It may, with reserve, be said of Lord Morley. That a man, wrote Macaulay, before whom the two paths of politics and literature lie open, and who may hope for eminence in either, should choose politics and quit literature seems to me madness. I speak from memory, but I think he wrote that letter when he was smarting under his defeat at Edinburgh. The dictum must therefore be taken with reserve, for the grapes were sour. But we may be grateful for a decision that gave us a history which Macaulay himself compared with Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, and which posterity, if it has not ratified that verdict, has placed among the imperishable things of English literature. Lord Morley, with the two paths open before him, came to a contrary decision. In middle age, with a secure European reputation in letters, he rose from the editor's desk and took a commission in the field. He gave up to a party what was meant for mankind, and left the harvest of his teeming brain largely ungarnered. When I see him, I seem to see a row of phantom volumes, books that will never be written, beginning with that Life of Chatham, the promise of which, made nearly 20 years ago, is still unredeemed, and I wonder whether posterity will endorse his decision as it has endorsed Michaelides. No man ever made a more dramatic entrance into office than he did. The announcement one morning that Mr. John Morley was the new Irish Secretary was the first clear indication of the most momentous departure in policy made in our time. It meant that Home Rule was the official policy of the Liberal Party. It startled the country then. If it could have foreseen all that it meant, it would have been startled still more, for it would have seen that it meant not merely a change of policy, but a political revolution, the end of an epoch, 20 years of reaction culminating in the emergence of the spectre of protection, and side by side with it the emergence into practical politics of social ideals which Lord Morley was wont to regard as the idle dreams of impatient idealists. For Lord Morley belongs to the past. He looks out on politics with reverted eyes. He has, it is true, more than any other man, the passion of the old philosophic radicals for liberty and political equality. He sat at the feet of John Stuart Mill, and wears the mantle of that great man not unworthily, though with a difference, for the disciple has less of the optimism of logic than the master. The spirit of the French Revolution still burns in him with a pure flame. Manchester, the Manchester of the mid-Victorian time, still speaks through him with unfaltering accents. He is the high priest of liberty, the civil and religious liberty of the individual. He stands for a cause that is largely won, but being won still needs that eternal vigilance which is the price of liberty, to hold as well as to win. That is his task. He is the guardian of the victories of the past. He is not a pioneer. He points to no far horizons, and stands icily aloof from all the eager aspirations of the new time. He will have nothing to do with strange idols. The gospel of social justice, that proclaimed by Ruskin and heard at the street corners, is penetrating into Parliament and changing the whole atmosphere of political thought, finds in him little response. He murmurs, "Impatient idealists," and is still. For reward he has incurred that subtlest of all rebukes, the praises of the spectator. The world of politics is a world of action, of quick resolves and firm and sudden movement. To hesitate is to be lost. Lord Morley has the hesitation of the man of thought. Hazlitt used to say that you could see the defeat of the Whigs written in the weak, fluctuating lower features of Charles Fox's face, just as you could see the victory of the Tories imaged in Pitt's aspiring nose. So in the deep-set, contemplative eye and indeterminate chin of Lord Morley you see the man who inspires others to lofty purpose rather than the man of action. In his study, alone with the past or the present, he hitches his wagon to a star and rides away into the pure serene. In a set speech, face to face with a great issue, he sounds a note of moral greatness, austere and pure, that is heard from no other lips to-day. But in the presence of a situation calling for immediate and drastic action from himself, he is like Hamlet and laments the cursed spite that has brought him face to face with a world of trouble. To do great things one must have a certain fearlessness of consequences, an indifference to responsibility, a fanatical faith, or a gambler's recklessness. Lord Morley has none of these qualities. The gravity and apprehensiveness of his mind revolt against the irrevocable word and make decisive action an intolerable pain. It is this perplexity of the will, so characteristic of the philosopher in affairs, that is perhaps the secret of Lord Morley's admiration for Mr. Chamberlain, for we all admire most that which we have not. He sees in him the quality of decisive action at its highest. Mr. Chamberlain never doubts, never hesitates. He risks his whole fortune on the cast of a die. He does not pause to think. He acts. He has no yesterdays, no moral obligations. Do the principles he has professed stand in his path? Then so much the worse for his principles. He discards them as lightly as the mariner disburdens his ship of the ballast in the hold. His days are not, like the poet's, bound each to each with filial piety. He does not care what he has said. He only sees the instant strategy and adopts it. Action, action, and again action. If it is necessary to burn his boats, he burns them on the instant. If it suits his purpose to change his coat, he changes it and is done with it. If his purpose can only be achieved by a war, then war let it be. No situation so obstinate but he will unloose it, familiar as his garter. If in no other way, then with the sword. He is a horse in blinkers. He sees neither to the right nor to the left, only to the goal ahead, and to that he flashes like an arrow to the mark. He knows that the thing the people love in a leader is swift decision and dramatic, fearless action. Right or wrong, act. Lord Morley, lost in reflection, weighing all the delicately balanced factors, sees with wonder the whirlwind go by. Nor is the dominion of reflection over action the only bar to the leadership of Liberalism which once seemed within his scope. For his reflection upon life is touched with an abiding melancholy which differentiates him from his masters, who saw in the triumph of reason and logic the solution of all the problems of society. He cultivates no such confident optimism, but seems to detect in modern life the odour of decay, to see our civilization not lit by the auroral light and bursting to perfect and enduring forms, but passing into the twilight whither the gods have vanished. It is of the late Lord Salisbury that he sometimes reminds one, though he has nothing of the grim acidity of that statesman. Lord Salisbury, it was well said, was like the leader of a lost cause, resolved to fight on, though well assured that nothing but defeat awaited him. His deep-rooted scepticism about all the tendencies of what he called our miserable life was qualified only by the disposition to resist all change, not because the existing social order was good, but because it existed, and because his despairing vision saw nothing but deeper glooms ahead. It was the disposition to bear the ills we have rather than fly to others that we know not of. The ship was doomed, and human effort an impertinence. Lord Morley's dejection is charged with the more active principle. It may be a losing fight in which we are engaged, but human effort after perfection is none the less not an impertinence, but the highest duty. The ship may be doomed, but we can still steer it by the stars. With Empedocles he says, "Fear not, life still leaves human effort scope. But, since life teems with ill, nurse no extravagant hope. Because thou must not dream, thou needst not then despair." A pessimistic philosophy is not inconsistent with the leadership of the Tory party. But to Liberalism it would be fatal, and even the Stoicism of Arnold, which more nearly represents the attitude of Lord Morley, would serve only as a check to dissolution. For Liberalism must be compact of dreams and inspired by extravagant hopes. 25 years ago the future of British politics seemed bound up with three friends, the most powerful triumvirate of our time. Citizen Chamberlain provided the driving power and the popular appeal, Citizen Dilke the encyclopedic knowledge of detail and affairs, John Morley the moral motive and the intellectual foundation. Together they could have moved mountains, but the combination, for various reasons, fell to pieces, and the great hope vanished in 20 years of dismal reaction. The pity of it, Iago, oh, the pity of it! It is one of the two great personal tragedies of modern politics. Of the three, Lord Morley alone remains in effective service, and upon him the preacher of political liberty, the irony of events, has placed the burden of despotic control over a vast subject people, dimly struggling towards freedom. It seems like a jest of fate, a jest to show how far the stern moralist, the foe of the reason of state, can resist the assaults of circumstance and of entrenched officialdom. It is too soon yet to judge of the result. The deportation of Lajpat Rai suggested that Lord Morley had begun to dig his own grave, but the victory of second thoughts still keeps him on the side of the angels. With courage he yet may make India his title to rank among statesmen of the first class secure, and then his claim to a double first will be established. But whether success or failure awaits him, he cannot fail to stand out as one of the most memorable figures of our time, for he breathes into the atmosphere of public life the quality it most needs and most lacks, the quality of a lofty and instructed moral fervour. It was that quality which made Victorian politics great. It is the absence of that quality which makes the politics of to-day so inferior in spirit, if not in purpose. There is no one left who can use the stops of the great organ save Lord Morley, and he in these days uses them only too rarely. 20 years ago a speech by John Morley was an event. I recall one great utterance of his in Lancashire as the most memorable speech I have heard. Its peroration, so simple and poignant, lingers in the memory like a sonnet. He was speaking of Ireland, and he closed, as I remember it, thus: "Gentlemen, do to Ireland as you would be done by. If she is poor, remember it is you who have denied to her the fruits of her labour. If she is ignorant, remember it is your laws that have closed to her the book of knowledge. If she is excessive, as some of you may think, in her devotion to a church which is not the church of most of you, remember that church was her only friend and comforter in the dark hour. Gentlemen, the dark hour is past. She has found other friends, other comforters. We will never desert her." You will catch that thrilling note in the oratory of Lord Morley at all times, for he touches politics with a certain spiritual emotion that makes it less a business or a game than a religion. He lifts it out of the street onto the highlands, where the view is wide and the air pure, and where the voices heard are the voices that do not bewilder or betray. He is the conscience of the political world, the barometer of our corporate soul. Tap him, and you shall see whether we are set at foul or fair. He has often been on the losing side, sometimes perhaps on the wrong side, never on the side of wrong. He is true as a dial to the sun, although it be not shined upon. There is about him a sense of the splendid austerity of truth, cold but exhilarating. It is not merely that he does not lie. There are some other politicians of whom that may be said. It is that he does not trifle with truth. It is sacred and inviolate. He would not admit with Erasmus that there are seasons when we must even conceal truth, still less with Fouché that les paroles sont faites pour cacher nos pensées. His regard for truth is expressed in the motto to the essay On Compromise. It makes all the difference in the world whether we put truth in the first place or in the second. This inflexible veracity is the rarest and most precious virtue in politics. It made him, if not, as Trevelyan says of Macaulay, the worst popular candidate since Coriolanus, at least a severe test of a constituency's attachment. It is Lord Morley's contribution to the common stock. Truth and justice, these are the fixed stars by which he steers his bark, and even the prayer book places religion and piety after them, for indeed they are the true foundation of religion and piety. It is this severe loyalty to truth and justice that is the note of his writings, this and a clarity and invigoration of style that give one the sense of a brisk walk on the moorlands. He is like the breath of winter, frosty but kindly. The lucidity of his thought is matched by the chasteness of his phrasing. He does not love what Holmes called the Macaulay flowers of literature. He does not burst into glossy purples that outredden all voluptuous garden roses. But he is a well of English, pure and undefiled, a well whose waters have never served any growth save what was noble and worthy. In personal intercourse he is singularly attractive. True, he has something of the impatience and hot temper that used to make his brother, the Doctor, so formidable and delightful. But the lightning is harmless and soon over, if you are good and discreet, and then his smile makes ample reparation. It is the most sensitive smile I know. The famous smile of Mr. Balfour has more of the quality of the charmeur, but this has the same winning pensiveness without the elusiveness and uncertainty of the other. And there is one sure specific for banishing his frown. Insinuate into the conversation a delicate reference to literature, and the sky clears magically. Then you discover where his heart really dwells, and are admitted to the most intimate chambers of his thought. He is like one who has escaped from the prison of the present with all its fateful tasks, to the free air where one may talk of the fathers that begat us and pass judgment upon all their deeds and words without the uncomfortable necessity of facing their problems and the peril of committing their errors. He is not and could never be a popular politician. He is too eclectic, dwells too much apart for that. "I am not a gregarious person," he once said, and apart from his passion for music, he has few popular tastes. But there is no man whose word carries more weight with friend and foe than his does. The old jibe at him about spelling God with a small g is no longer heard, for he has made men realize that there may be at least as much true religion in the spirit in which one doubts as in the most exact formulas of belief, and he has never divorced the chivalrous austerity of his teaching from the conduct of his own life. It was characteristic of him that when he lived on the top of the Hog's Back and kept a horse and trap to meet him at the station, he always walked behind the animal when it was going uphill. When men disagree with him, they do so with searchings of heart, for he is clear of the oak and the pine scrub and out on the rocks and the snow, and perchance his vision is most true. He brings to the consideration of politics that historic sense which is the most rare and valuable element in contemporary criticism. He seems aloof from the dust and heat of the conflict, watching the unfolding of a new chapter in the eternal drama of things, and making his comments not in the spirit of one of the actors, but with the cold detachment of the Greek chorus. The alarums and excursions of politics, its subtleties and stratagems, do not appeal to him. He is not conscious of them, has not that celerity of mind that moves with ease amid the tortuous labyrinth. He is stiff and remote, irritated by the asperities of the game, scornful of its expediencies. His true place is with Burke on the back benches, applying the test of eternal principle to the momentary task, rather than with Walpole on the Treasury bench, seeking to make principles bend to the necessities of occasion, and basing his calculations on the foibles and follies of men. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Rufus Isaacs, K.C. I got a telegram one morning stating that a libel action in which I was concerned was down for hearing that day. When I entered the law courts half an hour later, the case was already in progress. I had expected to find the air cold and inimical. Instead, I found the court beaming with good humor. Everyone seemed cheerful. His lordship leaned back in his chair with an air of comfortable calm. The jury leaned forward with various shades of amused interest upon their faces. Barristers and spectators seemed to be following a pleasant comedy. I took a seat and soon shared the prevailing spirit. My fears vanished in this easy, good-humored atmosphere. This was not the thunderstorm which I had anticipated with black forebodings. It was a pleasant, breezy day. The meaning of it was soon apparent. Mr. Rufus Isaacs was weaving his magic incantations. His geniality was infectious. You felt that every one was a good fellow. His lordship, look what an amiable, cheerful old gentleman he was. He wouldn't harm a worm. And the jury, what excellent fellows they were. And the plaintiff, an honest, nice man, labouring under a little misapprehension. And the defendants, equally honourable, equally nice, if you only knew them. And his learned friend, why, he was the best fellow of all. He exchanged nods and becks and wreathed smiles with the judge. He talked to the jury as though he had never met 12 such luminous-minded men before. He permitted his learned friend to trip him up on the mispronunciation of a name, thanked him gaily for his correction, repeated the offence, and laughingly rebuked his own forgetfulness. It was all done with a lightness of touch, a freshness and gaiety that were irresistible. Vainly did his learned friend try to stem the insidious tide. Vainly did he lash the poor defendants, villains of the deepest dye, vainly grow red and indignant, calling for heavy, yes, gentlemen of the jury, exemplary damages. His fierce denunciation fell on deaf ears. His demand for revenge sounded harsh and discordant in this kindly world. The judge frowned disapproval at the bitter note, and the jury gave him a farthing damages. And so home, very merry, as good Samuel Pepys would say. But I said to Mr. Isaacs afterwards, "Why did you alter your line of defence? You never touched on our real case." "My dear sir, his lordship is a plain man who loves a plain issue. Your real case was complex, and would have tired him and irritated him. He would have said, 'Gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence. If you think it is a libel, you will find for the plaintiff. If you have any doubts, you will find for the defendants. Gentlemen, consider your verdict,' or words to that effect. And down they would have come on you, for there was only one man in that box you could count on." I saw in this scene at the law courts something of the secret of the most brilliant career of the time at the bar. Sir Charles Russell won his triumphs by passionate intensity and autocratic compulsion. His eye flashed fire, and his tongue was an edged sword. He was like a torrent in spate, and the jury were swept along, helpless and unresisting, upon the swirling current. He dominated men by his impetuous wrath, by the energy of his mind and his manner. As he tapped his snuff-box and eyed you terribly over the pince-nez that hung low upon the nose, you felt that the storm was gathering beneath those pent brows, and you waited for the lightning that came with the flash of the outstretched forefinger. To cross his path seemed a misdemeanor. To be opposed to him was ipso facto to be in the wrong. He won by sheer passion. He gained the battle by the sword. Mr. Isaacs wins by wooing. It was said of Cobden that he was the only man who ever turned votes in the House of Commons. He did it, not by rhetoric, but by the sweet reasonableness of his persuasive talk. Mr. Isaacs has the same ingratiating faculty. He is so pleasant and amiable that it is a pain to disagree with him, so frank that you are sure that he is telling you all about it, so sensible that you feel he must be right. He does not browbeat the witness, or hector the judge, or dictate to the jury. He pervades the court with the sense of polite comedy. He makes everybody feel at ease, except his learned friend, who sees his case vanishing in wreathed smiles and urbane compliment. It is only when he leaves the box that the witness sees how he has been caught in the folds of that insinuating net. "I dreamed about you last night, Mr. Isaacs," said a surgeon, returning to the box. "You have been a nightmare to me. I have hardly slept since you let me out of the box on Friday. I dreamed you had examined me, and I seemed to have nothing on except bones." He has the intellectual suppleness of the East, and something of the mystery of his race. The Jewish mind at its best has an orbit outside the Western range, at its worst a depth below our lowest deep. The Jewish temperament is for us inscrutable. We are at home with all other minds, whether they be clothed in black skins or white, but the Jew, like the Japanese, is eternally alien to us. He moves in other spheres. He is motived by springs to which we have no access.
The soul of Spinoza, as he bends over his humble task of glass-cutting at The Hague, sails beyond the baths of all the western stars. Lasker, sitting over the chessboard, seems to dwell in the unexplored vastness outside our intellectual range. Shakespeare we grasp, but Isaiah has a vision that is not ours. Gladstone we understand, but who has fathomed the dark mystery that was called Disraeli? Slaves in eternal Egypt baked their strawless bricks, at ease in successive Zions, prating their politics. They are of every nation and of none. It is one of the greatest of living Jews who has best stated the strange duality of Israel, the splendor and squalor of his race. But even he has not wholly unveiled to us the heart of its mystery. The English mind is direct, obvious, emphatic. Its attack is frontal. It marches up to the enemy's batteries with bulldog courage and breaks the line or is broken in the attempt. You may take Mr. Gill as the legal type of the English mind. He goes for the witness with great smashing blows. He knocks the breath out of his body, if he can, and then turns, hot and perspiring, to receive his reward from the jury. Mr. Isaacs is all subtlety and insinuation. You cannot come to hand-grips with him. He is intangible. A duel between him and Mr. Gill is one of the most delightful spectacles I know. It is a duel between quarterstaff and rapier, all the weight on one side, all the agility on the other. It is like those immortal combats in The Mermaid between Ben Jonson, massive and slow as a Spanish galleon, and Shakespeare, swift and elusive as an English frigate. Down comes the quarterstaff with an immense sweep, and there is Mr. Isaacs leaning lightly upon his sword, or gently pricking the defenseless flank of his opponent, his pleasant face more aggravatingly pleasant than ever. It is all a gay comedy. His spirit is still the spirit of the boy who ran away to sea and served before the mast on the Blair Athol. He found that stowing the main skysail and cleaning the brasswork were not such fun as they seemed in fancy, and he decamped at Rio de Janeiro. But he was laid by the heels and had to finish the voyage round by Calcutta. 2 years in Magdeburg as the German agent of his father's business satisfied him that superintending shipments was little better than stowing the main skysail of the Blair Athol, and he turned up on the Stock Exchange, where, I believe, he lost money and won fame with the gloves. Then, rich in worldly wisdom, he went to the Temple, where worldly wisdom is more valuable even than law, and stepped breezily out of the chambers of Mr. Lawson Walton into a practice that led to £20,000 a year, a dwelling in the paradise of Park Lane, and any office that he may choose to aim at. He probably knows more of human nature in its crude state than any man of his time. He has seen it where it is most naked and unashamed, in ships at sea, in trade, on the Stock Exchange, and in the Temple, where its most rapacious and unlovely aspects are unveiled. And it is not surprising that one finds in him a touch of good-humoured cynicism mixed with the breezy carelessness of his demeanour. Most lawyers have a touch of cynicism. Diogenes might find an honest man in the Temple. He certainly would not find an idealist. The law is death to dreams. Perhaps it is this want of the atmosphere of dreams that makes the lawyer generally so arid a figure in politics. The lawyer who succeeds in politics on a grand scale is rare, and with few exceptions he succeeds not because, but in spite of, the lawyer qualities. Mr. Asquith is the exception to the rule. Men never thought of Harcourt as a lawyer. Russell's passion for Ireland obliterated the lawyer, and the only occasion on which Sir John Rigby touched the heart of the House was when a pipe fell from his pocket as he was seen to be, after all, a man and a brother. Mr. Isaacs is not an arid figure in the House. His personality is too piquant, his outlook too bright and human. But he is not a great parliamentary figure. The impression he creates is that of a light skirmisher on the fringe of the battle. There is no compelling conviction, no burning zeal that carries him passionately into the heart of the conflict. Contrast him for a moment with Sir William Robson. I have seen them both in court, in cases in which I was involved, And, let me put it modestly, I prefer Mr. Isaacs. But in the House, how different their values! Mr. Isaacs is the lightest of weights, Sir William Robson one of the most commanding of contemporary political minds. It is not perhaps in this case the difference between the lawyer who is primarily a lawyer and the lawyer who is primarily a layman. It is the difference between the English mind and the Jewish mind in relation to British politics. The Jewish mind is essentially outside our politics, despite the sorceries of Disraeli. The Jew is a citizen of the world. He has no patriotism, for he has all patriotisms. If he is orthodox, his loyalty is to his race. If he is unorthodox, his loyalty is commonly less reputable. The only Jew I can recall who had the root of the matter in him, who really thought about English politics as an Englishman thinks, was Goshen, and no one thought of him as a Jew. When Mr. Isaacs' name was canvassed in connection with the Solicitor Generalship, a barrister said to me, "There is too much work for one man, and Mr. Isaacs is the only man I know equal to the task. His energy and power of work are incredible. He is in bed at 11, and he is up at 4 when the courts are sitting. 4 hours he is at his briefs, and then, fresh as a lark, he is at the courts, winding up with an afternoon and evening at the House. He carries his work as lightly as he carries his triumphs. He is wholly unspoiled by success, a pleasant, debonair figure, easy in all company, telling a bright story with droll enjoyment, the brilliant black eye of his race sparkling with fun, the mobile mouth working with the genial current of his thought. Wherever his brilliant path may lead him, whether to the woolsack or to the seat of the Master of the Rolls, whose most famous ornament, Jessel, was like himself a Jew, it will lead him to no place he is not fitted to adorn." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19, The Bishop of London. Bishop Creighton wrote The History of the Papacy. His successor preached on When It Was Dark. The fact is significant of much. We hear a good deal today of the poverty of the Church. The poverty is real, but it is not the poverty of money. It is the poverty of men. The Church shares the national bankruptcy. We may say of England, much more truly than Cassius said of Rome, that we have lost the breed of noble blood. We are traveling across the plains. There is no peak on the skyline of our vision. There is no personality that stirs our emotion or excites our expectation. We have much cleverness, much energy, much talent, but we have no great men. We are an army without leaders. Johnson said of Burke that you could not meet him casually sheltering from a shower of rain without discovering that you were in the presence of a man of genius. Though the rain pelted down today over all the British Islands, it is doubtful whether it would drive a single man of genius of this generation to shelter. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. In this intellectual impoverishment, the Church of England has more than its due share. Some 25 years ago it echoed to the sound of great voices. Lightfoot was at Durham, Westcott and Magee at Peterborough, Temple at London, Stanley at Westminster, Liddon at St. Paul's, Hort at Cambridge, Tate at Canterbury. They were like beacon lights in the land. Today the darkness is lit with feeble and uncertain lamps. Dr. Percival, Canon Barnett, and Dr. Gore alone have the ear of the nation, and 2 of them belong to the past generation rather than the present, and none rises to supreme greatness. Among the younger men no figure emerges more considerable than that of the Bishop of Stepney, an astute ecclesiastic, or Canon Hensley Henson, an erratic and indeterminate quantity. The Church is poor indeed. It seems to have lost its attraction for the best minds even of an inconspicuous time. Arthur Foley Winnington Ingram is therefore typical of his generation. When he preached on Guy Thorne's shallow novel, he reflected the poverty of the thought of the Church, just as Mr. Hall Caine reflects the poverty of literature and drama, or Lord Northcliffe the poverty of journalism, or Mr. Austen Chamberlain the poverty of politics. We are in the backwash of the intellectual tide, and the Bishop of London is with us. We feed ourselves on thin, emotional gruel, and the Bishop of London shares our food. And yet it might be claimed for him that though he is not a great man, he is a great bishop. For there are two kinds of episcopal greatness. There is the intellectual greatness, which stamps itself upon the mind of the Church. Such was the greatness of Tate. And there is a certain administrative greatness and personal magnetism which quicken the diocese and touch the heart of the crowd. And such is the greatness of Bishop Ingram. Long ago Selden stated the function of a bishop. "For bishops to preach," he said, "'tis to do other folks' office, as if the steward should execute the porter's or the cook's place. 'Tis his business to see that they and all others about the house perform their duties." Dr. Ingram offends against this law by preaching constantly, but he fulfills the latter part of it perhaps better than any man of his time. He is a great steward of the Church. He is a great bishop, too, in the sense that he is a great Christian. His heart is filled with the love of his fellow men, but most of all with love of the poor. From the days when he left Lichfield and came to the Oxford House settlement in the East End, he has given himself to the cause of the disinherited and the miserable. Slumming to him has been no idle diversion. It has been his vocation, his life. Into it he has poured all the wealth of a boundless joy, of a nature all sunshine and generous emotion. He, as much as any man of our time, has realized that if you would reach the souls of men, you must first care for their bodies, heal their sores, lessen their miseries. And full of this primitive law of the faith, he has carried the cup of cold water to the lips of the dying girl in the garret, labored to drain the morass of the slum, lived his days and his nights among the forsaken and the hopeless. And then, his heart full of the goodness of the poor rather than of contempt of their squalor, he has gone down to Oxford to call others into the same harvest field. "It was an address he gave when I was an undergraduate," said a friend of mine to me, "that brought me here 10 years ago to live in the slums. I thank God for it." Or he has gone out into Victoria Park to meet the atheist face to face, answer their pet posers with ready wit, and win their hearts by his genial comradeship. He is not a humorist, but he has the gift of inexhaustible good humor. "I enjoy," he says, "every minute of my work, every minute." And he has the happy answer ever ready to turn the attack. "Please, sir," said the Sunday school child when he had asked the class for questions, "please, sir, why did the angels walk up and down Jacob's ladder when they had wings?" "Ah," said the bishop, "very good indeed. Now, would any little boy or girl here like to answer that question?" He is not afraid to stoop to conquer. Careless of his boots and his toes, he learned the foot and door trick, as he calls it, in order to penetrate impenetrable homes. After long hesitation, he says in his work in great cities, the door will be opened about half a foot by a little girl. You will hear a distant voice from the wash-tub in the rear, "Well, Sally, who is it?" Then Sally will answer at the top of her voice, "Please, mother, it's religion." It is the defect of the average church dignitary that he is remote from the people, dwells in another atmosphere, talks another language. Dr. Ingram thinks their thoughts, talks their speech, is one of themselves. He is a man who hails you Tom or Jack, and shows by thumping on your back how he esteems your merit. And he does it without offense. If he digs you in the ribs and tells you to buck up, you do buck up. If he lends you his greatcoat or gives you a lift going down to Poplar, you have no feeling of being patronized. He is one of yourselves. He is a pal. He does not fill you with the sense of the awful respectability of religion. He fills you with the sense of its good fellowship. And he so warms the hearts of men where his gaitered brethren too often freeze them. Take the incident at the Church Congress at Northampton, a serried rank of solemn bishops and deans facing a crowd of Northampton shoemakers. Could the force of contrast further go? Could anything bridge the gulf between?
Could anything warm this Arctic atmosphere? Suddenly a light, athletic figure, face clean-shaven, eyes twinkling with merriment, stepped forward and began to talk of his life in the East End. It was the Bishop of London. "I remember," said he, "my first Sunday in Bethnal Green. I addressed a meeting of 500 men, and at the end of the service I said to them, 'Well now, what shall we talk about next Sunday?' And immediately 500 voices yelled out, 'Eternal punishment!' That was a nice little subject to hurl at a young man who was out on his own for the first time in his life. And then, of course, they wanted to know who was Cain's wife. They always do. Well, we settled that question, and we buried the poor old lady in Bethnal Green once and for all. The bishops and the deans looked grave and pained, but the shoemakers were won. The gulf between platform and hall was bridged, and the solemn dignitaries could cross with ease. It is this breezy intimacy that has made him win a hearing for religion among those who are indifferent or who regard it as an enemy. "Look at 'em! Just look at 'em!" said the bus driver, waving his whip towards the crowd gathered round the bishop, preaching from the open-air pulpit at St. James, Piccadilly. "I ain't religious, mind you, and I can't stomach parsons. They're fair p'ison to me, but 'im, well, 'e's different. There's something 'uman about 'im. I 'eard 'im down East many a time, and I tell you, when you've been a-listening to 'im for a bit, a kind of clean feeling take 'old of you, same as if it was your day off and you'd 'ad a bath and got your Sunday suit on." And he has the same access to the rich as to the poor. "Bishop," said the stockbrokers, who gathered around him after he had preached to them at Wall Street, "Bishop," and they grasped his hand, "you've made us feel real good." Then I have no doubt that they went back cheerfully to the business of rooking their neighbors. He does not divorce preaching and practice. What is good for others is good for him. What he would have others do, he first does himself. And so, when he preaches temperance, he does not follow the example of Bishop Morehouse of Manchester, who, I remember, once opened a temperance speech with the declaration, "I am not a teetotaler," an affirmation which effectually froze the meeting. When Dr. Ingram, discussing temperance, was asked by a workman, "Are you a tot?" his reply was, "Of course I am." "All right, then," came the reply. "Fire away. We'll listen to you." He has little erudition and less theology, but he has the religion of service and sacrifice, and it is the only religion that counts. The best argument for religion, says Mark Guy Pearce, is 6 foot of Christianity. It is the argument that Dr. Ingram employs, and wherever he goes he carries the sunshine with him, for he has the unconquerable optimism of the man who, in giving himself for others, finds the miasma of vain questioning vanish from his own sky.
Solvitur laborando.
If you would be a pessimist, sit in your study at Kensington and think about the horrors of the East End. Do not go and live and work in the East End. Pessimism perishes in the East End, for pessimism is the poisonous fruit of brooding, and optimism the gracious flower of service. It is perhaps to be regretted that the Bishop of Stepney ever became the Bishop of London. He is, as I have said, a great steward of the Church. His labours never cease. "I do all my reading and most of my writing here," he will tell you, as you sit in his brougham in the light of his electric reading lamp. He rises early, retires late, lives sparingly, is poorer than when he had 1/10 of his present income, fills every day with 100 duties, and applies his 2 maxims, "worth while" and "don't be afraid to be human," to every one of them. But his true sphere is Bethnal Green Road, and the life of the mean streets that he loves and knows and has helped to transform. He is too light an intellectual weight for statesmanship or the leadership of thought. His excursions into politics are jejune, his point of view too narrowly ecclesiastical. One likes to think of him, not in the House of Lords defending indefensible privileges, but as the parish priest in the East End, living the life, fighting for the faith, and carrying the sunshine of his happy spirit into the sunless homes of the forlorn and the miserable. End of chapter 19.
Chapter 20 of Prophets, Priests, and Kings by Alfred George Gardiner. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20, Prince Bülow. On some rising ground by the port of Hamburg there is a statue, rude, colossal, looking out over the landscape. In its suggestion of brutality and force it is incomparable. It stands out against the sky like a ruthless menace, and in fancy one sees a sea of blood surging at the base. It is the statue of Bismarck looking out over the Germany that he welded with blood and iron. With this vision of the Vulcan of modern Europe fresh in the mind, you turn out of the Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin into the Chancellor's residence, and pass through into the park where Bismarck used to stride about with his great boarhounds for companions. Today the Chancellor holds a reception. You advance through the gay throng, thinking of those terrible brows and that fierce, barbaric figure with the boarhounds, and find yourself in the presence of a suave and polished gentleman with a black poodle. He takes you by the hand and leads you aside with winning cordiality. He gives you the impression that you are the only person he really cares for in all that company. It is for you he has been waiting and watching. You gather that your affairs are his constant companion, and that his interest in them is one of his really serious attachments to life. He stoops and pats the black poodle, surrenders you with an air of regretful affection, and turns to the next comer with his genial smile. Bismarck was force. Bülow is finesse. Bismarck was the iron hand. Bülow is the velvet glove. Bismarck's tread sounded like thunder through Europe. Bülow treads softly. He is the most accomplished courtier in Europe. He disarms you by his unconquerable blandness and friendliness. I saw him described in an English paper recently as worn out and harassed, looking too tired and apathetic to be a happy man. I have never seen a man who looked less harassed, less tired and apathetic, more at ease with himself and the world. He carries his 60 years with the spirit of youth. His eye is clear and laughing, the carriage of his tall, soldierly figure erect and alert, his conversation full of an engaging sprightliness. He has none of the challenging air of the typical Prussian, and his vivacity suggests Rome rather than Berlin, the boudoir rather than the battlefield. He wins by subtle address. With Bismarck it was a word and a blow, and the blow first. When Richter used to attack him in the Reichstag, he would rise in a sort of apoplectic wrath, tug at the stiff collar of his uniform, and hurl his thunderbolts about in blind fury. Prince Bülow meets the assaults of Bebel, of the twinkling eye and the fiery eloquence, with the weapons of wit and politeness, for he has brought into German parliamentary warfare a style of oratory, polished and urbane, which is wholly contrary to the traditions of a country where politics are harsh and intolerant, and where your public foe is your private enemy. He has the elusiveness of the diplomatist. The impression he conveys is that of an elegant trifler with affairs, one who is as free from hates as he is from passionate enthusiasms. No urgent moral or human motive governs him. He has followed Bismarck's ruthless policy in Poland, but without Bismarck's ruthlessness of spirit, for he has nothing of Bismarck's fierce intensity. His heart is never engaged. When he utters his occasional Bismarckisms, they fall from his lips robbed of their thunder. "Let the man alone," he said, replying in the Reichstag to Mr. Chamberlain's reference to the German army. "Let the man alone. He is biting at granite." It was a fine saying, but it was an echo. The voice was the voice of Bülow, but the words were the words of Frederick the Great. The true Bülow utters himself in lighter and more airy fashion, in the language of gay persiflage. "Well, why wouldn't Miss Italy have an extra dance if she wants one?" he asked when Germany is disturbed by the appearance of a violent flirtation between Great Britain and Italy. "It would be absurd to show jealousy." And so with the Socialists. He never stamps at them with Bismarck's brutal violence. He is polite and ironical. He seeks to laugh them out of court by superior wit and pleasantry. All parties are one to him, for he is vassal to no political theory. The machine of government is a thing apart from the life of the people. It is the property of a class — his class. The public, what have they to do with the law except to obey it? He might say with a famous Bishop of Exeter, but he would say it with more suaveness of phrase. Democratic government is an ideal which fills him with polite scorn. The people are children to be ruled with paternal kindness and tickled with the phrases of chauvinism. His political empiricism is exhibited in his block. The idea of ruling through an alliance of the Clericals and the Liberals could only have occurred to a mind without any fixed principle of internal political development. It could only have occurred also in a country where the spirit of Liberalism is dead and only the shell remains. Prince Bülow's politics, in fact, are the politics of the Foreign Minister. Human rights and human wrongs do not interest him. He dwells, like his Emperor, outside them in the realm of imperial dreams. The Baghdad Railway is more to him than the desolation of Macedonia, and a great navy is more than the impoverishment of the people that is its price. In all this he represents the spirit of German policy, with its large ambitions and its divorce from the humanizing tendency of modern politics. It is a spirit that contrasts strikingly with the spirit of France, which, now as ever, bears the banner of civilization. France is in the 20th century. Germany, with its wonderful organization, is spiritually still in the 18th. It will remain there until the inspiration of its government comes not from the court, but from the people. But with all his imperialism, Prince Bülow would seem to love war as little as the Kaiser. Wars themselves are not half so interesting as the events that cause them, he said long ago, and in these words spoke the diplomatist. And again, war is a vulgar thing, and at this time of day the man who prevents war is greater than the man who wins battles. He will never talk like Bismarck about bleeding France white, but the Morocco affair left an uneasy sense that his pacifism is not wholly to be trusted. Trust, indeed, is not a quality that springs from so supple and adroit a personality. His imperturbable urbanity and savoir-faire, concealing a certain Machiavellian view of government, are the secret of Prince Bülow's success. They have enabled him to remain on the top for 11 years in a world of intrigue as tortuous and unscrupulous as an Oriental court. How tortuous, how unscrupulous, the world realized through the noisome revelations of the Harden-Moltke case. It is the consequence of a government which centers not in the people, but in an autocrat. Prince Bülow, of course, denies this. When replying to Bebel on one occasion, he declared that camarillas and intrigues were not peculiar to absolute monarchies. I have, he said, spent a portion of my life in countries which are governed on strictly parliamentary lines. I have also lived in republics. I can assure Herr Bebel that intrigues and backstair influences and all that sort of thing flourish in those countries a good deal more than in ours. Never has so much incense been burned before princely vanity as there is now burnt before King Demos. The courtiers of King Demos are superior to the courtiers of princes in the art of cringing and fawning. Yet outside the realm of romance it would be difficult to find a story of political plotting to parallel that in which Prince Bülow has played so interesting a role. It is a story in which we see the Emperor as a tool in the hands of a subtle intriguer, who weaves his plots and pulls his strings from the coulisses behind the scenes. There is no more sinister figure in modern European politics than that of Prince Philip Eulenburg, who now has fallen, like Lucifer, never to rise again, bringing down with him in his final catastrophe Count Posadowski, with the long grey beard, whom I used to see taking his coffee every afternoon in the café opposite the Palast Hotel. Eulenburg has been the Warwick of Germany. Even in Bismarck's day, this strange, elusive figure was a power strong enough to win the hate of the Iron Chancellor, who would have no rival near the throne. "He has eyes that can spoil my breakfast at any time," said Bismarck of him. "He does not want to be anything, neither Secretary of State nor Chancellor. He thinks with Voltaire, 'L'amitié d'un grand homme est un bienfait de Dieu.' That is all he wants. He is an enthusiast, a spiritualist, and a fine talker in the style of Radowitz. For a man of the Kaiser's dramatic temperament, that kind of man is very dangerous." Eulenburg did not only not want to be anything, he feared to be anything, for he wanted to be everything. He wanted to be the invisible power behind the throne, and he knew that if he became Chancellor, his official relations with the Kaiser would destroy that power. So he contented himself with being ambassador at Munich, from whence he pulled his strings. Bismarck fell, Caprivi fell, Hohenlohe, who hated Eulenburg, also passed, and Baron von Bieberstein, perhaps the ablest statesman in Germany, having been spirited away to Constantinople, the way was clear for Eulenburg's nominee. That nominee was Herr von Bülow, who, after a career in half the embassies of Europe, St. Petersburg, Paris, Bucharest, Athens, and Vienna, was now ambassador at Rome, and married (he had eloped with her) to a brilliant Italian princess of the house of Camporeale, a stepdaughter of the Italian statesman Mengedi. Bülow and Eulenburg were old friends, using the familiar "thou" in their intercourse. But Bülow's wife loved Italy and did not love Berlin, and, it is said, travelled to Vienna to plead with Eulenburg not to press the nomination. The story of this journey is denied by Prince Bülow. "It is an excellent story," he said in the Reichstag. "It has only one defect. It is not true." Whether true or false, Eulenburg had his way. Herr von Bülow became Count von Bülow and Imperial Chancellor. Then the Eulenburg web was woven at a furious speed. The Chancellor was his nominee. Eulenburg then got Monsieur Lecomte, a friend of his Munich days, appointed to the French embassy in Berlin, which gave him the key to Franco-German relations. Two lieutenants of his, Holstein and Kitterlen-Wächter, were at the Berlin Foreign Office, and finally he secured the appointment of his former military attaché, Count Kuno von Moltke, as military governor of Berlin, a position that brought him into daily contact with the Kaiser. Eulenburg was supreme. He held all the strings in his hand. The Camarilla that enmeshed the unconscious Kaiser ran the empire. The world began to talk, even to print. Eulenburg fell out with Holstein, and the Morocco affair enabled him to secure his dismissal by the Kaiser. Coldness had sprung up between Eulenburg and his Chancellor, for Count von Bülow had proved too great a success to please the ambitious master of the palace. He could talk as brilliantly as Eulenburg, and his influence with the Kaiser was becoming dangerous. He was marked for slaughter. But a sudden attack from another quarter incontinently brought the whole fabric to the ground. Herr von Holstein, smarting from his dismissal and the desertion of Eulenburg, took Herr Harden, the most brilliant journalist in Berlin, into his confidence. Conveniently, at this time, the wife of Count Kuno von Moltke divorced her husband, and this unsavory affair became mixed up with Harden's exposure of the Camarilla. All this time the Kaiser was sublimely unconscious of how he was ruled, and still visited the Eulenburg seat. But one day the Crown Prince placed half a dozen copies of Harden's paper in his father's hands, and the crash came. Moltke was dismissed, Eulenburg ostracized, and Posadowski, innocent, able, gray-bearded Posadowski, whom Eulenburg had selected as the successor of the Chancellor, deposed from his post as Minister of the Interior, where he had done more for Germany than any man of his time. And so Prince von Bülow, prince on the morning that Declassé fell, survives, the last relic of the Eulenburg system, more powerful than ever, so powerful that the Kaiser has begun to feel uncomfortable, so powerful that the fate of Bismarck already overshadows him. "His days are numbered," said a student of politics in Berlin to me. "He lasts because the Kaiser can find no one to succeed him. We are so poor in men who are at once able and liked by the Kaiser. But he will go."
When he falls, there will be nothing of the tragedy that surrounded the fall of Bismarck. The old Chancellor's dismissal was like a sentence of death to him. "You take my life when you do take the means whereby I live." He had two passions whereby he lived, the passion for power and the passion for the Germany that he had created. When he was cast out of the Wilhelmstrasse, he was beggared. No attachment to life remained to him. Prince Bülow will pass out as cheerfully as Charles Lamb left the servitude of the East India Company. He will smile as blandly as he smiles now when he receives you in the Wilhelmstrasse, and his black poodle will be with him. He will not be found in Prussia, nor in his native Mecklenburg, nor even in Germany. Italy is the land that holds his heart, and it is there, in Rome, that he has bought a lordly pleasure house, the Villa Malta, which he purchased from Queen Margherita for £200,000. For Prince Bülow, fortunate in all worldly things, is a rich man. He was not rich when he went to Berlin, but an admirer had the happy thought to die and leave him a fortune which brings him in 500,000 marks a year. Upon that he and his wife will be able to cultivate those polite tastes which are their chief interest in life, for the Prince loves art and literature and archaeology, and will quote the poets of half a dozen tongues, while the Princess, a pupil of Liszt, is devoted to music. End of Chapter 20.